The bell that rings at Highclere Castle at 5 in the morning on a cold Tuesday in October 1912 is bell number 9. It sounds in a stone passage in the basement, on a long wooden board studded with brass bells of graduated size, each labelled in careful black lettering with the name of a room upstairs. 9 is a bedroom on the second floor, a gentleman guest perhaps, wanting hot water, perhaps only turning in his sleep and knocking the cord by his bed. Above stairs, in 300 rooms of yellow bath stone and gilded plaster, the Earl of Carnarvon and his family and their guests are still asleep. No one in that half of the house hears bell 9 ring at all. But someone hears it. A girl of perhaps 16, already awake for an hour, already on her knees in front of a grate on the ground floor, hears the pitch of that particular bell and knows without looking up which room it belongs to. She has learned the pitches the way a musician learns intervals. She stands, wipes coal on her apron, and starts up the back stairs. The house has not yet noticed itself. It will not notice her either. That board still hangs in the basement of Highclere Castle today. You can walk down to it. The brass bells are still there, dulled now, the black lettering faded but legible, and if you stand in the stone corridor and look at that panel, you're looking at the nervous system of a machine that ran on human beings, 40 of them, sometimes closer to 80, depending on the season, depending on who was coming to shoot the pheasants, depending on whether the family was in London or in Egypt or expected home by Friday. 40 to 80 people whose entire waking lives were arranged around that board and the bells hanging on it, and whose names, in most cases, the house's own official record never bothered to keep. This is a documentary about them, about the real Highclere, not the version filmed with soft light and a string quartet and Maggie Smith raising an eyebrow at the wrong fork. The Hampshire house that Julian Fellowes rented for his fiction is a real building with a real history, and the people who kept its fires lit and its floors polished and its chamber pots emptied were real people whose lives were shorter than yours, colder than yours, and structured by a system so complete that leaving it was, for most of them, not a practical option. The bell rings at 5 in the morning, someone answers it. And the question this whole story turns on is who that person was, what she owed for the privilege of that bed in the attic, and what the house took from her in exchange for a roof. Start with the cold. The basement corridor at Highclere in October, before the coal ranges are lit, is the temperature of the ground itself, which in Hampshire in autumn means somewhere just above freezing. The floors are stone, not stone tile but great slabs of it, worn concave in the middle from a century of footsteps in the same paths. There's no carpet down here. Carpet is for above. Down here there is stone and whitewashed brick, and the smell of coal dust that never quite leaves the air, because coal dust has settled into the mortar and the aprons and the hair of the people who work here. There's the smell of tallow from the candles, the smell of blacking from the grates, the smell of yesterday's mutton fat from the scullery. If you walk this corridor now, in the dark, before the fires were lit, you would smell all of that layered together and underneath it the mineral cold of the stone. The candlelight is a detail people forget. Highclere in 1912 had gas in some parts of the house, and electricity was creeping in, but the servants' quarters were the last to be modernised because the servants did not vote on the modernisation. A scullery maid at 5 in the morning worked by a tallow candle stuck to a saucer, or by the reflected glow of the coal range she'd just persuaded back to life. She held that candle in her left hand while she carried a coal scuttle in her right, up the stone steps of the back stairs in silence, because silence was a condition of employment. Above her, the house sleeps, the Herbert family, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, George Herbert, and his American-born wife Almina, whose money, as we'll come to, was the reason any of this ran at all. Their 2 children, guests, perhaps a visiting cousin, perhaps a Rothschild, and perhaps, if the weekend has been well arranged, a member of the royal family in a bedroom with its own fire that will need to be lit before he rings for it, because the arrangement of a good house is that the fire is already warm when the master wakes. That means someone was in his bedroom, on her knees, in the dark, while he was still asleep in the bed 6 feet away. She was not to look at him, not to make a sound. She was to lay the fire, light the fire, close the fender, gather her tools and vanish before he stirred. If he stirred and saw her, she had failed. That was the standard. There's a thesis buried under all of this, and it's worth saying now because the rest of the story is proof of it. Highclere Castle was not maintained by the Earls of Carnarvon. Highclere Castle was maintained by a workforce of 40 to 80 people at any given time, and the fundamental design of the house, both its architecture and its bookkeeping, was engineered to make that workforce invisible. Not merely quiet, but invisible. The corridors they used were behind the walls, the stairs they climbed were behind doors covered in green baize to muffle sound. The letters they received were sometimes opened by the housekeeper first, and when they left service, or died in service, or were dismissed from service, the estate's official records for the most part did not preserve their names. There are exceptions. A handful of names survive in family correspondence: Mary Morton, Anne Gaymore, W. Pascoe, William Venn. They appear in letters, in accounts, in the occasional receipt. Most of the others, the great majority, are gone, not because the paperwork was lost, but because the paperwork was never generated in the first place. That's the machine we're looking at. A 300-room house in Hampshire, run on human labour at industrial scale and structured to leave no trace of the humans who ran it. The bell rings at 5 in the morning, someone gets up, and the whole point of the system is that you, upstairs, would never know she had. Now consider what she has to do before you open your eyes. 40 fireplaces. That's the working number, though the true figure varied by season and by which wings were in use. 40 fireplaces in the staterooms, the family bedrooms, the guest bedrooms, the dining room, the library, the drawing rooms, the smoking room, the morning room, the study. Each one of them, in October, needs a fire, and each fire needs coal. Coal doesn't come up from the basement by conveyor. Coal comes up in scuttles carried by hand up the back stairs. A full scuttle of coal weighs perhaps 40 pounds, and a housemaid at Highclere in 1912 might carry that weight up a flight of stone stairs a dozen times before breakfast. Then she carries the ash back down. The ash is filthy and gets everywhere. Her apron is grey by 7 in the morning, and she'll have changed it once already. Before the fire can be lit, the grate has to be cleaned. Yesterday's ash raked out, the bars blackened with a paste that smells of turpentine and rubs into the skin of your fingers and does not come off with soap. The hearth swept, the fender polished, and then the fire laid. Paper twisted first, kindling arranged in a lattice above it, small coals placed in a specific pattern, larger coals held back until the smaller ones catch. This is a craft. A good housemaid can lay a fire that draws cleanly on the first match. A poor one produces smoke that fills the room and wakes the guest, which is a firing offence. Wake a guest with your smoke, and by afternoon you're packing. And that's one fireplace. There are 40. Some of them are on the second floor, which means the coal has been carried up 2 flights of back stairs before it reaches the grate. Some of them are in rooms currently occupied, which means the fire is being laid in the dark with a shielded candle, 6 feet from a sleeping human being who must not be disturbed. Some of them are in the staterooms downstairs, where the standard is not merely a functional fire, but a beautiful one that appears to have been kindled by magic sometime shortly before dawn. At the same time, water is being heated. Every hot bath in the house, every wash basin, every shave requires water heated in the basement kitchen on a coal range that must itself be lit and coaxed to temperature. That water is then carried up in brass cans, wrapped in a cloth to hold the heat, up the same back stairs the coal came up, and set outside the bedroom door of whoever has requested it. If the request came in the form of bell number 9, the girl who answered the bell will have carried that can from the basement all the way to the second floor and left it, and returned to her other work and not been thanked. Because thanks between staff and family were not a currency of the house. The apparatus that made this possible was architectural. The house had been substantially remade in the 1840s under Sir Charles Barry, the same architect who worked on the Palace of Westminster, and Barry understood what a great Victorian house was supposed to do. It was supposed to display, and it was supposed to hide. The two functions were joined by a single design principle. The servant should be able to reach any room in the house without ever being seen using a corridor that a guest might use. That meant a parallel infrastructure of back staircases, service corridors and doors set into panelling that opened into passageways a guest walking down the state corridor would never notice. And separating the two worlds, at every threshold, a door covered in green baize cloth. The baize did two things. It softened sound, and it absorbed smell, which mattered more. The basement kitchen was directly beneath the family dining room. The smell of a leg of mutton at 7 in the morning, or a fish stock reducing on the range, or a scullery maid's boiled tea was not permitted to travel upstairs. The baize door caught it and held it below. If you stood in the Great Hall at Highclere in 1912, in your dinner clothes, holding a glass of champagne, you would have seen no evidence that the house was staffed at all. The footman who entered the room did so through doors you did not notice. The plates were cleared by hands you did not see arrive. Coal appeared in the grate as if the grate had grown it. Your bed, when you returned to it, had been turned down, your nightclothes laid out, your slippers warmed by the fire. None of this happened by accident. All of it happened because 40 people were moving through a shadow version of the house, on the other side of the bays, at every moment of the day and most of the night. The hierarchy of those 40 people mattered enormously. At the top, in domestic terms, sat the butler. He commanded the male indoor staff, kept the plate, poured the wine, and answered directly to the Earl. Opposite him, and equal in authority, the housekeeper. She commanded the female staff, held the keys, ran the linen, and answered directly to the Countess. Beneath them, on the ladder, came the lady's maid, a personal servant to the Countess, and the valet, a personal servant to the Earl. Beneath them, the footmen, 2 or 3 or 4 of them depending on the household's needs, chosen for height and matched in appearance, because a matched pair of footmen in livery was a form of display in itself. Beneath them, the housemaids sorted into ranks, head housemaid, second housemaid, third, and so on down. Beneath them, in the kitchen, the cook, and beneath her the kitchen maids, and beneath the kitchen maids the scullery maid, the lowest of the female indoor staff, whose job was to scour pots and scrub floors and never appear in a room where the family might see her. Beneath her, if you counted him at all, was the hall boy, a child of 13 or 14 who did what he was told and slept where he was put. And then, radiating outward from the house itself, the outdoor staff, grooms, coachmen and later chauffeurs, gardeners, 20 or more of them, running the walled gardens and the glass houses that provided the estate with its own peaches and pineapples out of season, gamekeepers, whose work made the shooting parties possible, estate carpenters, blacksmiths, laundresses in the laundry cottage, dairy workers in the dairy. Even at the low end of the ranges, an estate like Highclere required a small town's worth of people to function. The 40 to 80 indoor staff we've been talking about are only the visible tip of that, and even they were engineered to be invisible. The point of laying all of this out is not to admire it. The point is to feel the weight of it settling onto the shoulders of the girl on her knees at 5 in the morning. She's at the bottom of that ladder. There are perhaps 30 adults above her in the hierarchy of the house, each of whom has some measure of authority over her, each of whom can report her to the housekeeper for a fault. The housekeeper reports to the Countess. The Countess, if she notices at all, may mention it to the Earl, and at any point in that chain, a decision can be made that the girl is no longer wanted at Highclere. When that decision is made, she leaves. She takes her small trunk, her second apron, her Bible if she has one, and she leaves. What she takes with her, or fails to take with her, will decide the rest of her life. Which brings us to the paper. In Edwardian England, a domestic servant did not have a resume. She did not have a certificate. What she had, if she had anything, was a character. A character was a written reference from her previous employer, describing her conduct, her honesty, her sobriety, her skill, and her reason for leaving. It was a single piece of paper. It was written entirely at the discretion of the employer. There was no standard form, no independent verification, no appeal. The employer could write anything she wished, or nothing at all, and the servant had no legal instrument by which to compel a favourable version or a truthful one. Without a character, a servant could not be hired into another good house. Housekeepers of great estates did not take on staff without a character. Registry offices in London, which placed servants into households, would not send a girl without a character out on interview. A young woman who had trained for 6 years as a housemaid, who knew how to lay a fire and clean silver and turn a bed and dress a lady's hair, who had no other trade and no other education, was, without a character from her last position, unemployable in the only work she'd been prepared to do. She could go into a factory. She could go into the workhouse. She could, and some did, go into worse places than either. But she could not go into another Highclere. There was a statute on paper which was supposed to regulate this. The Servants' Characters Act of 1792 made it a criminal offence to write a false character, either to inflate a bad servant into a good one or to blacken a good servant out of malice. The act sounds like a protection. In practice, it was a fiction. Enforcement required a prosecution, which required evidence, which required a servant with the means and the standing to bring a case against a member of the gentry. By 1910, more than a century after the Act was passed, the number of successful prosecutions under it stood at, by contemporary accounts, 1. That's the number of times, in the working lifetime of the Act, that the State of England had successfully punished an employer for lying about a servant. The Act existed. The protection did not. What did exist was the letter. At Highclere, the estate's formal administrative records of its indoor staff are, by the standards of a house of that scale, remarkably thin. There are wage books, patchy in places, and household accounts. There is not, in the main, a personnel file of the kind a modern institution would keep. What survives, and what historians who work in the Carnarvon archives have to reconstruct the lives of the servants from, is correspondence. Family letters. Letters between the Countess and the housekeeper. Letters between one great house and another, in which a lady writes to a friend to ask whether a particular housemaid who has applied for a position is really as steady as she claims. Names surface in these letters: Mary Morton, Anne Gaymore, W. Pascoe, William Venn. A sentence here, a paragraph there. She's a good, quiet girl. He does not touch drink. She left of her own accord to nurse her mother. He was let go for reasons the writer does not care to put into a letter. That last kind of sentence is the one that ended careers. The writer does not care to put it into a letter, meaning ask me at a house party, meaning I will tell you in private, meaning do not hire her. A servant against whom that sentence was written did not know it had been written. She might present herself at a new house, with what she believed to be a decent character in her hand, and the housekeeper interviewing her might already have received by the second post a private note from a friend at the previous house explaining what the character did not say. The paper in the girl's hand meant nothing. The paper she never saw meant everything. This was the mechanism of control. Not chains, not the whip, but paper. A system in which every servant knew, from her first day in her first place, that the entire arc of her working life, and therefore of her life, sat in the ink of the person she was currently working for. If you displeased the housekeeper, she might not dismiss you today. She might dismiss you next spring, and write a character so cool it would freeze you out of any comparable position, and you would spend the rest of your life stepping downward, from great house to lesser house to boarding house to whatever came after. If you displeased the Countess, if you were seen to be sullen at the wrong moment, if a piece of jewellery went missing in a room you had cleaned, if a guest complained that you had looked at him, the machinery of the character could be moved against you without your knowledge, and you would find out only by the pattern of doors that no longer opened. The 17-hour day, from 5 in the morning to 10 at night, ran on this. The silence ran on this. The pretense that a fire had lit itself and a scuttle of coal had climbed the stairs on its own, all of it ran on this. A girl who thought about walking out of Highclere in October of 1912 was not being held there by locks. She was being held there by a piece of paper she did not yet possess, that would be written about her by a woman she rarely spoke to, that would decide whether she ate the following winter. And this is where the story quietly turns, because a power that total does not usually restrain itself. A system in which one party holds every card and the other party holds none is a system that, in most human arrangements, produces open abuse. Yet the great houses of Edwardian England, Highclere among them, are not usually remembered as sites of open abuse. The memoirs of former servants that survive from the period, some of them, describe places of comfort. William Lansley, who rose from hall boy to house steward and wrote about it, called good service a home. Others tell a different story. The truth sits somewhere in the space between what could have been done to these people and what actually was, and the reason the machine did not simply grind them to powder is a question that the next part of this story has to answer. Because the answer is not kindness. The answer is something more complicated, and it lives on a specific floor of Highclere Castle, in a specific set of rooms, and it has a specific name attached to it. For now, the bell has rung. It is still 5 in the morning. The girl is on the back stairs with a scuttle of coal, and the house above her has not yet stirred. The board in the basement is quiet again, the brass bell of number 9 still faintly swaying on its spring. She has 39 more fires to lay before the family comes down to breakfast. She has water to carry. She has ash to remove. She has, folded in the small tin box under her bed in the attic, a character from her last position, 3 sentences long, that she has read so many times she knows it by heart. She does not yet know what her character from Highclere will say. That is being decided day by day in a house whose owners do not know her name. The name being decided in that house, the name that pays for the fire she's laying and the coal she's carrying and the wages she will collect at the end of the quarter, is not the one carved above the door. It is not Carnarvon. It is Rothschild. This is the first thing that has to be said about Highclere Castle in October of 1912, and it is the thing that no guest crossing the gravel in a motorcar was meant to know, and no servant polishing the silver was ever going to say out loud. The great English country house whose master would soon be world famous as the patron of the tomb of Tutankhamun, whose walls advertised 8 centuries of English land, whose seat in the House of Lords rested on the assumption that his family had been here since roughly forever, was in practical fact being kept afloat by the private fortune of a Jewish banker in the city of London. The Earl of Carnarvon was land-rich and cash-poor, and the land alone, in the Edwardian agricultural depression, no longer generated anything close to what the house on top of it cost to run. The Countess was young, American in speech, illegitimate in birth, and she had walked into the marriage with a dowry that historians have estimated in the region of £500,000, a sum that in the wages of 1895 would have paid a scullery maid's annual salary tens of thousands of times over. Her father, Alfred de Rothschild of the London branch of the banking house, did not stop writing cheques after the wedding. He continued to underwrite the couple until his death in 1918. And so, the fires in the 40 grates, the ice in the cellars, the game on the sideboard, the wages in the servants' hands, the very idea of Highclere as a functioning household in the 20th century ran on the quiet, regular arrival of money from a source the household would never publicly name. The girl on the backstairs does not know this. She does not need to know it. It is not the sort of thing a scullery maid is told, and it is certainly not the sort of thing a countess discusses in the corridors of her own house. But it is the fact that shapes everything above her and everything below. It shapes the size of the guest lists. It shapes the number of courses at dinner. It shapes how many footmen are hired and how many housemaids are put on when the family goes up to London for the season. It shapes whether the boiler is repaired this winter or patched for another year. It shapes, most of all, the mood of the woman who runs the house, because the woman who runs the house is aware, in a way her husband perhaps preferred not to be, that the money is not theirs in the ancestral sense. It is hers, and it is her father's, and it is being spent at a rate that would frighten a professional accountant. Consider what she was spending. The archival research done by the present Countess of Carnarvon, working from the family's own account books, has turned up figures that read, when set beside a scullery maid's £14 a year, as though they belong to another species of arithmetic. A single weekend of country house hospitality, 3 days of guests could run to sums that converted forward sit in the neighbourhood of £360,000. That figure covered 3 days, not the season and not the year. 3 days of pheasant and champagne, and beds turned down and boots cleaned in the boot room, and hot water carried up the back stairs in cans. The girl below whose fires warmed those guests was earning, if the higher end of the scullery scale applied to her, £18 for the whole calendar year, and if she was at the lower end, perhaps as little as 10. She could have laid every fire in the house every morning of her adult life, and never in 100 years have earned what a single Saturday to Monday shooting party cost the Countess to put on. This isn't a rhetorical comparison, it's the ledger. The house ran on that ratio, and the ratio was possible only because a bank in the city was quietly making up the difference. Alfred de Rothschild had no legitimate children, and Almina, born in 1876 to Marie Wombwell, while Marie was still nominally married to someone else, was, by every reliable indication, his daughter, in fact if not in name. He treated her as such. He indulged her. When she asked him for money, and by all accounts she asked often, he sent it. There is a phrase used by those who have studied her. She raided the Rothschild fortune. It is a startlingly accurate verb for what was happening. The raid was not resented because it was not resisted. The father wanted his daughter to be a countess more than he wanted to keep the money, and the daughter wanted to be the sort of countess whose parties were talked about in London for weeks afterwards, and the husband, who had married her in June of 1895 with roughly £150,000 of inherited debt hanging round his neck, wanted the debt gone and the house saved. All 3 parties were content with the arrangement. The only people not consulted were the servants, who were required to maintain the fiction that this was an ordinary English aristocratic household, running on ordinary English aristocratic land, and whose labour made that fiction visible in polished brass and folded linen every day of the year. The Countess of Carnarvon, who wrote the modern history of the house, has recorded a phrase that catches the transformation exactly. Almina went into St Margaret's, Westminster, on the morning of June 26, 1895, as the illegitimate daughter of a Jewish banker, and she came out of St Margaret's some hours later as the Countess of Carnarvon. The English social system, so scrupulous about blood, had allowed a great deal of money to overrule a great deal of blood, and it had done so quietly, and it had gone on doing so quietly for the next 17 years, and it would go on doing so for a few years more. The house on the hill in Hampshire was, in that sense, one of the earliest and most successful examples of a pattern that would define the 20th century of the English aristocracy. The ancient title propped up by newer, mobile, often foreign, often disliked money, and the ancient title in return granting that money a respectability it could not otherwise buy. For the servants, the practical consequence was almost invisible in the daily round, and almost total in the long view. It meant in the daily round that they were unusually well fed because Almina spent freely on the kitchen. It meant that the house was warm because coal was ordered without much reference to the price of coal. It meant that new liveries were made when the old ones wore, and that the silver was replated when it needed replating, and that a hall boy who tore his jacket was not, as he might have been in a shabbier great house, docked the cost of the mending. Highclere in the Edwardian years was known, among servants who knew such things, as a good place, and the goodness of the place ran directly on the tap of Rothschild money. It also meant, in the long view, that the entire structure of employment for those 40 to 80 indoor servants rested on the health of one elderly banker in London and on the mood of one young woman upstairs, and that if either the banker died or the young woman decided one morning that she was tired of Hampshire, the whole edifice would begin to tilt. The banker was in his 70s, the young woman was not yet 40. That fact sat quietly under everything the girl on the back stairs was doing with her coal scuttle, and she did not know it, and the housekeeper did not know it, and the butler perhaps suspected it, and the countess certainly knew it, and the earl, in the way of husbands in that class, preferred not to think about it very often. So there is the frame. Now come back inside the frame, and stand for a minute at the foot of the back stairs at 10 minutes past 5 in the morning, and follow the girl through the day the money paid for. By the time she reaches the kitchen with the last of her fires laid and the last of her coal scuttles emptied, it is not yet 7, and her day has properly begun. In the scullery, a small stone-floored room off the main kitchen, the sinks are already full because the last of the previous night's washing up did not finish until well past midnight, and some of it, the heavier copper pans, the greasier serving dishes, was left to soak. She takes off the coarse apron she has been wearing on the stairs and puts on the coarser one she wears in the scullery, and she begins. Cold water, because hot water in a house of 40 fireplaces was for the family and their guests, not for the girl who washed their plates. Lye soap, which stripped the grease off the copper, and if you weren't careful with it, stripped the skin off your hands at the same time. Sand or fine grit for the pans that would not come clean with soap alone. Silver sand for scouring. By the end of the first hour, her fingers are already raw at the knuckles, and this isn't the exception. This is the ordinary daily state of a scullery maid's hands in an Edwardian great house, and the memoirs from below stairs are unanimous about it. Chapped, cracked, bleeding at the creases, and wrapped at night in whatever grease she could beg from the kitchen to try to soften them for the following morning. The kitchen range is next. The great cast-iron range that ran the length of one wall, that burned coal from 4 in the morning until midnight, that produced every meal for family and servants alike, had to be black-leaded. This was a ritual done every morning, or nearly every morning, and it was the scullery maid's job. Blacklead was a paste, graphite-based, that you applied with a brush and then buffed with cloths until the iron gleamed like fresh gunmetal. Doing it properly took the better part of an hour, doing it while the range was still cool enough to touch, and yet the cook was already wanting to heat it for breakfast was the delicate part. She worked fast. The paste got on her arms, on her apron, on her forehead when she wiped sweat away, and by the time she was done she was a shade of grey from the elbows up. Then she washed her arms in cold water because the fire was going in now, and the cook needed her for the vegetables, and there were 40-something guests upstairs whose first breakfast tray was already being assembled. The stone floors of the kitchens and sculleries and passages were scrubbed on hands and knees, not mopped but scrubbed. A pail of cold water, a scrubbing brush, a bar of coarse soap and a rag, and you moved backwards along the flags an arm's length at a time. And if the housekeeper found a corner you had missed, she did not raise her voice. She simply took a piece of chalk and drew a small circle around the missed patch and left it for you to see when you came back through. That was the correction. A chalk circle. A phrase, not a shout. And the phrase was in the shape of a ring of white on grey. Between the range and the floors and the sinks and the vegetables and the fetching and the carrying, she ate. She ate quickly, at a scrubbed deal table in the servants' hall at set times, in a rigidly ordered seating plan in which the butler sat at the head and the housekeeper at the foot, and the upper servants ate their pudding in the housekeeper's room, while the lower servants ate theirs at the table, and she, as a scullery maid, sat near the far end and did not speak unless spoken to, grace was said. Meat was carved. She was fed adequately, better than she had been at home most likely, and this too was part of what held her. For many of these girls, the food at Highclere was the most reliable food they had ever eaten in their lives. The Countess was generous with the kitchen because the Countess could afford to be, and the girls at the far end of the table felt that generosity in their bones every day, and it was, in its own way, a chain. Then back to the scullery, the forenoon washing up, the preparation for luncheon itself, which for the family might be 12 at table, and for the servants might be eaten in shifts. The afternoon lull, which was not a lull, because it was when the housemaid stripped and remade beds, and the still-room maid put up the preserves, and the scullery maid caught up on whatever the morning had left undone. The dressing bell at 7, when the family went upstairs to change for dinner, and the corresponding rise in tempo in the kitchen, because dinner in an Edwardian great house wasn't a meal, it was a production. 7 courses was ordinary and 9 was not unusual. Each course meant plates, and each plate meant washing, and there was no machine. There was only her, and a kitchen maid perhaps, and the cold tap, and the lye, and the sand. She finishes washing up somewhere between 10 and 11 at night. If the family have had guests, and in the shooting season they almost always had guests, she finishes later. She climbs the back stairs to the attic where the female servants slept, 2 or 3 to a room in the lower ranks, and she undresses in the dark to save the candle, and she lies down in a narrow iron bed under a thin blanket, and she thinks, if she has energy to think anything, about the fact that the bell will ring again at 5. She's had, if she was lucky, about 90 minutes across the day that were not accounted for by a specific task. 90 minutes in which she perhaps sat down, perhaps ate, perhaps mended a stocking, perhaps went quickly to the outside privy in the servants' court. That was her rest. 17 hours of labour, 90 minutes of pause, and at the end of the year, when the housekeeper counts out her wages into her hand somewhere between £14 and £18 in coin, less any small deductions for breakages or replacements, and out of that she's expected to buy her own uniform aprons, her own boots, her own stockings, and to send something home to her mother if her mother is still living and if her father is not. The Countess upstairs on the same day may have spent more than her annual wage on a single arrangement of flowers for the dinner table. This isn't indignation writing, it's the account book. The flowers in Almina's Highclere came from London by train, in season and out of it, and the bill for them arrived monthly, and it was paid. The point of laying it out in this granular way is that the labour was not incidental to the house, it was the house. Every polished surface, every warm room, every silent corridor, every promptly answered bell, every folded napkin, every laid fire, every cleaned boot, every drawn bath, every carried tray, every scoured pan, was the direct output of a body that had begun its day in the dark and would not finish until the dark returned. And the design of the house, the baize doors, the back stairs, the hidden corridors, was engineered to make that body invisible. When the family and guests moved through the state rooms, they were not to see who had done the work. They were to see only the work done. A servant who found herself, by accident, in a corridor when a member of the family was approaching, was expected to turn her face to the wall and stand still, or to step into the nearest empty room until the family had passed. She was to become, functionally, part of the wallpaper, mute and forgotten, in the phrase that recurs in the memoirs. The wages of that muteness were £14 a year, and the promise, held out at the far end of it, was that if you were very good and very lucky and very patient, in a decade or 2 You might be the housekeeper who drew the chalk circles instead of the girl who had missed the corner. Whether there was any real route out of that life is a question the next chapters will have to answer honestly. For now, hold that day in your mind and understand it as one day out of thousands, and understand that in October of 1912 there were between 40 and 80 people at Highclere, living some version of it, and that above them, in the staterooms and on the terraces and in the gunroom, another kind of day was unfolding that used up their labour as fast as they could produce it. Because the day above stairs, in those years, was the shooting party. Between roughly 1900 and 1913, Highclere lived in what was, by any measure, the social peak of its history as a private house. The fifth Earl was a genuine connoisseur of the sporting life. He had been a serious motor racer before an accident in Germany damaged his health. He was a fine shot. He kept the sort of stable and the sort of kennels that guests noticed, and he entertained accordingly. His wife's money, and her taste for hospitality, and his own social standing, combined to produce a calendar in which the house was almost never empty for long. In November, it was pheasants. In August, it might be Scotland for the grouse. In June, it was Ascot, and the London house filled up. In between, there were the smaller weekends, the friends passing through, the political guests, the racing set, the intimates. And at the top of the guest book, more than once, in the years before he came to the throne and after, was the Prince of Wales, whose visit to any English country house was the social confirmation that mattered above all others, and who accepted the Carnarvon's hospitality readily enough, because the Carnarvon's hospitality was quite simply superb. A shooting party at Highclere in those years was a machine within a machine. The guests, 40 or so at the peak, did not arrive alone. A gentleman brought his valet, a lady brought her lady's maid. Sometimes she brought her own footman if she was travelling with jewels, and sometimes a nurse if she had a small child in tow, and always, of course, her trunks, which meant her trunks required carrying and unpacking and pressing and rehanging. The below-stairs population of the house, which on an ordinary week might be 60 souls, could nearly double overnight when a full shooting party arrived. 60 became 100, sometimes more, and every one of those additional bodies had to be fed and housed and slotted into the hierarchy, and slotted quickly because the hierarchy did not tolerate ambiguity for long. This was where the hierarchy inside the hierarchy became sharpest, and where the resident staff felt it most. A visiting valet, the personal servant of a duke or a cabinet minister, outranked the resident footman, and expected to be shown to a seat higher up the servants' hall table, and expected the resident staff to attend to his master's boots as promptly as if the master were their own. A visiting lady's maid, particularly one attached to a well-known beauty, could carry herself with an authority that irritated the resident housemaids for weeks after her departure. There were quiet skirmishes over precedence at breakfast. There were disputed points about who sat where when there were 3 ladies' maids at table. There were resentments about who would first call on the ironing room, and who was expected to give up her bed so that a visiting upper servant could have a room to herself for 3 nights. The butler and the housekeeper spent shooting weeks refereeing these skirmishes as much as they spent them running the house, and the girl in the scullery, whose position was too low to be involved, simply washed twice as many plates. And through it all the outdoor engine ran. The gamekeepers had been at work since the spring, rearing pheasants, feeding covers, minding the woods. The beaters, hired from the surrounding villages by the day, walked the coverts driving the birds towards the guns. The loaders stood at each gentleman's elbow, holding a second gun ready, so that a good shot could keep firing while the first was reloaded. The luncheon, taken in the field or in one of the estate lodges, was brought out from the house in hampers by footmen who had helped clear breakfast and would help serve dinner. Nothing about it was casual. The bag at the end of the day, the count of birds shot, was recorded in the game book in the Earl's own hand, and the good days in the Highclere game book of that era ran into the hundreds, and on the great days into 4 figures. Every one of those birds had been reared for the gun, walked towards the gun, shot in front of the gun, picked up by a dog, carried to a cart, hung in a game larder, and by the end of the week plucked, drawn and cooked in the kitchen, where the girl in the scullery was washing the plates it had been served on. The whole apparatus, from the London flowers to the reared pheasants, to the visiting valets to the doubled scullery, depended on one condition, and that condition had held for so long that no one at Highclere, in 1912, felt any particular urgency about it. The condition was that there existed, in the villages of Hampshire and Berkshire and beyond, an inexhaustible supply of young men and young women willing to accept the terms of domestic service. £14 a year, 90 minutes of rest, the chalk circle, the character, the muteness, the attic bed. So long as that supply held, the house could run at any scale the Countess's ledger could support. The supply was already, quietly, beginning to narrow. In the mill towns of the north, in the shops of the great cities, in the new department stores of London and Manchester and Birmingham, wages for young women had begun to creep upward, and hours had begun to shorten, and crucially evenings had begun to be one's own. A shop girl in a Kensington department store in 1912 might earn less in the week than a Highclere housemaid earned into board and lodging combined, but she went home at night to a room she rented, and the room was hers, and no one drew chalk circles on her floor, and no one wrote a character that decided whether she could take her next position. In the factories the same shift was underway. Trade unions were organising women in ways they had not before. Newspapers had begun to talk with a slightly puzzled tone about the servant problem, which was the phrase the property classes used to describe the fact that fewer and fewer girls from the villages were willing, when the choice was offered them, to go into service. The cry heard by employers, the phrase that turned up in reports and letters and pamphlets, was blunt enough. No more private service for us. At Highclere in 1912, this was still a distant murmur. The house was full, the guest list long, the kitchen staffed, the bells promptly answered. If a housemaid left in the spring, another was found by the summer. The pipeline had not broken. It had only, in ways the Countess's household accounts did not yet reflect, begun to thin. And no one in the staterooms upstairs watching the guns come in from a good day's shooting with the low autumn sun behind them and the dogs at their heels and the birds in the cart could have been persuaded that the world that produced this scene was about to end. It had, after all, been like this in some form for centuries. It would surely go on being like this for centuries more. It had, at that moment, less than 2 years to run. There's a phrase that turns up again and again in the surviving letters of Edwardian domestic servants, in the memoirs some of them wrote decades later, when their working lives were behind them, in the household rules pinned to the back of pantry doors in country houses across England. The phrase is no followers. 2 words. It appears on the printed regulation sheets that were handed to housemaids on the first day of a new place. It appears in the character letters that housekeepers wrote about departing girls, sometimes as praise, sometimes as warning. It appears in the diaries of butlers instructing footmen on what would and would not be tolerated. And it meant, in the plainest possible language, that a young woman in service was not permitted to have a private life. A follower was a man, any man. A boy from the village she'd grown up with, a groom from the stables, a delivery boy who lingered too long at the tradesman's entrance, a soldier home on leave who came to the servant's door hoping to see her. The rules did not distinguish between a serious suitor and a childhood friend. They did not distinguish between a conversation at the gate and a meeting in the woods. The category was the offence. To be found with a follower, or even to be suspected of one, was grounds for immediate dismissal, and dismissal without a character was, as had already been established, the end of a working life. The rules were not unique to Highclere. They ran through the great houses of England as a matter of custom so uniform that no one thought to write down its origin. The Countess of Carnarvon's household would have applied them as any household of that scale did. In practice, they meant that a housemaid who wished to walk out with a young man had to do so in secret, on her half-day off if she was granted one, in a village she did not live in, at an hour when she could not be seen. She could not receive letters that anyone else in the servants' hall might notice. She could not accept a gift. She could not, if she valued her position, admit to any attachment at all. For male servants, the rule took a different but equally severe form. A footman or under-butler could not, in most large households, be a married man. The role required him to live in, to sleep in a bedroom near the plate, to be available at all hours, to present himself in livery at any moment the bell required. A wife, and the household a wife implied, was incompatible with the terms of the position. Some men in service delayed marriage into their 30s or 40s, waiting for a promotion to a role. Butler in a smaller house, steward on a country estate that might come with married quarters and a small cottage. Some never married at all. The men who did marry often did so at the cost of the position they had spent a decade climbing to, and the household that lost a trained footman to a wedding treated the loss as a defection, not a milestone. The result, across the great houses of Edwardian England, was a workforce composed deliberately, of people held in a kind of prolonged adolescence, adults in every measurable sense, doing skilled work under enormous pressure, but forbidden the ordinary attachments that adulthood is built around. No spouses, no children, no settled homes of their own, no evenings that belonged to them. The house did not merely employ their hours, it occupied the interior life that would, in any other life, have been used to build the private world a person lives in when work is done. And then there was the matter of pregnancy. For an unmarried female servant, pregnancy was not a difficulty to be managed. It was an ending. There was no maternity provision, no leave, no acknowledgement, no discussion. There was the moment the housekeeper's eye caught what a loosened apron could no longer hide, and there was the interview, and there was the trunk carried down the back stairs by a hall boy who had been told not to speak to her, and there was the door onto the drive, and there was no character, and there was nowhere to go. The father of the child, if he was a fellow servant, might be dismissed too or might not, depending on how useful he was to the house. If he was a man from outside the estate, he was not the household's concern. If he was a man from inside the family upstairs, or a guest of the family upstairs, the matter was, in the phrase that appears in more than one account of these cases from the period, dealt with privately. Which meant that the girl went, and the man stayed, and the account book did not record why the maid's wages had ceased to be paid on a particular Friday in a particular month. The letters that survive from Edwardian servants in situations of this kind are among the most painful documents the era produced. They are short, most of them. They are written in the careful hand of women who had been taught to write by village schoolmistresses and had not written much since. They ask sometimes for money. They ask sometimes for a reference of any kind, however qualified. They ask sometimes only for an acknowledgement that they had once worked in the house and had done their work well. The replies, where the replies survive, are often written by the housekeeper on the mistress's behalf, and they are formal and they are brief, and they do not, as a rule, grant what is asked. The girl went to a sister in another county if she had one. She went to the workhouse if she had not. She went, in the phrase that runs through the parish records of the period like a low grey line, to service of another kind, and the house continued. The loneliness these arrangements produced is documented in the servants' own words, in the memoirs written in the 1920s and 1930s by women who had been in service before the war and lived long enough to describe it. They wrote about the strangeness of sharing a room with another girl for years without ever being permitted to speak to her after the bedroom door closed at night, because the rule was silence and the housekeeper's room was on the same corridor. They wrote about the peculiar geography of an affection that had nowhere to be placed, a fondness for a fellow servant that could not be admitted because friendship between the housemaids and the footman was itself suspect. They wrote about lying awake at 4 a.m, in the dark of an attic room in a house whose owners were still at dinner in London, and understanding that the life they were living had no room in it for a life of their own. They wrote about grief for parents they had not seen in years, because the 2-week annual holiday, if it was granted at all, had gone instead to a sister's confinement or a brother's funeral. And they wrote, some of them, with a low, steady anger that had waited 40 years to be set down on paper, about the way the house had asked them for everything they had and had given them, in return, no acknowledgement that they had ever possessed anything to give. The question the rule opens and does not answer is what happened to these women at the end. A housemaid who entered service at 14 and stayed in it, faithful, characterful, unmarried, unpregnant, obedient to the rule of no followers for 40 years, arrived at 54 with a body worn out by stairs and buckets and coal, and no home of her own to go to. Some households, the very grandest, kept a small tradition of pensioning off long-serving retainers, a cottage on the estate, a few shillings a week from the family's private funds. It was not a right, it was a favour, granted where the family remembered, withheld where it did not. Almina's High Clear, funded by Rothschild money, was in a position to be generous when it chose to be, and there is evidence in the surviving accounts that in certain individual cases it was. There is no evidence that generosity of this kind was systematic, or that a servant could count on it as she aged. The alternative for a housemaid at 54 with no family and no savings and no cottage was the parish workhouse. That is the shape of the life the rule of no followers built. A private self forfeited at the baize door in girlhood, and at the other end of it, when the strength was gone, a door that was not a private door at all. This is the world the 5th Earl of Carnarvon and his Countess presided over in the autumn of 1912, and it is the world unchanged in any of its essentials that they were still presiding over when the Earl, that same autumn, was already several years into a preoccupation that would eventually make his name known to millions of people who had never heard of Highclere. The preoccupation was Egypt. Carnarvon had first travelled there for his health, after a motor accident in 1901 had left his chest permanently vulnerable to the damp of an English winter. The winters he began to spend in Egypt from around the middle of the decade drew him, as they drew a great many wealthy Englishmen with time and money, towards the antiquities that were then being cleared and catalogued at a great rate along the Nile. From around 1907 he had entered into a formal working partnership with an archaeologist named Howard Carter, a man of humble origins and formidable field skill who had spent his working life in Egypt and knew the ground of the Valley of the Kings as few other men knew it. The partnership was of a familiar Edwardian shape. Carter had the expertise, Carnarvon had the money. What Carnarvon had, more precisely, was access to money, because the money itself was Almina's, and Almina's money was Alfred de Rothschild's, and the pounds that funded the seasons of digging in the valley were pounds that flowed by exactly the same channel as the pounds that paid the Highclere kitchen and the Highclere wages and the Highclere flowers. The dig, in its early years, produced little. The Valley of the Kings had been worked over by generations of excavators, and the received opinion in Egyptology by around 1912 was that its major tombs had all been found and that anything remaining was scraps. Carter did not believe this. He believed, on grounds that he had assembled painstakingly from fragmentary finds and archival hints, that at least one royal tomb of the 18th dynasty had not yet been located, and that its occupant was a minor and short-reigning pharaoh named Tutankhamun. Carnarvon paid the concession fees. Carnarvon paid the workmen. Carnarvon paid the shipping and the season's expenses and the salaries, and Almina, through the Rothschild pipeline, paid Carnarvon. And Highclere, through the same pipeline, paid its scullery maids their £14 a year. The two enterprises, the excavation in the valley and the running of the castle in Hampshire, were not separate operations at different ends of the world. They were the same operation, run out of the same account, sustained by the same source. The girl scrubbing the range at 5 a.m. in the Highclere basement, and the Egyptian workman lifting a basket of rubble out of a trench in the Valley of the Kings on a February afternoon, were being paid, ultimately, by the same banker in London. When the discovery came, and when Carnarvon's name attached itself to it, and became one of the most famous names of the 20th century, that fact would not be part of the story that was told. The story that was told would be of the aristocratic patron and the driven archaeologist and the golden mask beneath the sand. The story that was not told was of the household that had made the patronage possible, and of the specific human labour that had been organised, hour by hour at £14 a year, to free the patron to spend his winters elsewhere. And in the years between 1912 and the discovery, the household that funded the dig was changing under its own feet. The servant problem that had been a distant murmur in the autumn of 1912 became, after August 1914, a rupture. The rural pipeline of young women willing to accept the terms of service, already thinning before the war, did not survive it. Wages in every other sector rose. Women's factory work became not just available but honoured. The character letter, which had held such absolute power over a girl's life in 1912, lost some of its power once she could walk into a munitions plant and be hired without one. Post-war, the wages a housemaid could command doubled and then some, and the hours she would accept shortened, and the deference she would offer thinned. The below-stairs world that had run without friction through the Edwardian decade was, by the early 1920s, harder and more expensive to maintain, and the great houses that had run on the old terms were beginning quietly to close whole wings, dismiss whole categories of staff, cover the furniture with dust sheets in rooms that had 10 years earlier been in daily use. Carter's discovery arrived into this changed world. In November of 1922, in a corner of the Valley of the Kings that had been dismissed by other excavators as exhausted, his workmen uncovered a step cut into the rock. The step led to another, and then to a passage, and then to a sealed door bearing the cartouche of Tutankhamun. Carter cabled Carnarvon in England. Carnarvon travelled out. On the 26th of November, standing at a small hole cut into the second sealed door, holding a candle, Carter looked in. Carnarvon, behind him, asked whether he could see anything. Carter's answer, one of the most quoted sentences of the 20th century, was that he could see wonderful things. Gold. Everywhere the glint of gold, The wonderful things had been paid for by, among many other quiet sources, the labour of scullery maids in Hampshire. 5 months after that candle was raised in the antechamber, Carnarvon was dead. The cause of death, on the 5th of April 1923, was blood poisoning from an infected cut, a mosquito bite nicked open by a razor and gone septic in the Egyptian heat. He was 56 years old. Almina reached him in Cairo shortly before he died. The news went out by cable to a world that had spent the winter following every dispatch from the valley with an appetite the press had never quite seen before. Highclere received the news in a household that had been quietly reorganising itself for years, and what the household then did in the weeks and months after the Earl's death is the story that comes next. But before it can be told, there is another story that has to be placed on the record, because it belongs in the middle of these years, and because the archive has been so successful at keeping it in the margins that it has to be lifted out deliberately. Between the autumn of 1914 and the summer of 1919, Highclere Castle was not a country house, it was a hospital. Almina, moving with a speed and a competence that even her critics acknowledged, had converted the staterooms and the principal bedrooms into wards, operating theatres, recovery rooms. The Arundel bedroom became a surgical theatre. The library became a ward. Nurses moved on the state floor where footmen had moved. Officers, wounded on the Western Front and shipped home through the casualty clearing stations of France, arrived at Highclere in ambulances up the same drive the shooting parties had come up. Almina paid for the conversion. Alfred de Rothschild paid for the running of it. The press wrote about the Countess in language that had, until then, been reserved for saints and queens, the patriotic matron, the great lady who had opened her house to England's wounded sons. The photographs showed her, elegant, competent, at the bedside of a young man whose bandages ran from his shoulder to his wrist. The country, in a war that had begun to consume its middle-class families at a rate no one had prepared for, read those photographs with gratitude. The gratitude was not misplaced. Almina's work was real. The hospital treated hundreds of men over the course of its operation, and the standard of care it offered, the quality of surgery, the ratio of nurses to patients, the food, the linens, the recovery times, was of a kind that few military hospitals could match. Officers who passed through Highclere wrote letters home describing conditions so far removed from the trenches that the contrast on the page reads almost as vertigo. Some of those letters survive in the Highclere archive. They are written in the careful hands of young men who have been told to write to their mothers, and they describe the roses in the vases and the view from the window and the taste of the soup, and now and then, in a wobble of the pen where an injury has damaged the hand or the nerve, they betray the fear of the man beneath the courtesy, the fear of the theatre of war he will be sent back to as soon as he is well. The men Highclere treated, without exception, were officers. That was the classification of the hospital, and it was not unusual. In the strict social ordering of the wartime medical system, officers were treated in one category of facility, and other ranks were treated in another. Highclere, as an officers' hospital, was doing precisely the work its class made available to it. And in the servants' quarters, in the wing of the house that had not been converted, and in the villages of Hampshire and Berkshire, from which the male staff of Highclere had been drawn for a generation, a different set of men were putting on a different uniform. The footmen went. Some of them enlisted within weeks of the declaration. Footmen, hired for their height and their bearing and their appearance in livery, were exactly the physical specimens the recruiting sergeants of August 1914 were looking for, and the pressure on them to volunteer, from the household, from the villages, from the press, from the family upstairs, was as strong as any pressure applied to any group of young men in the country. The grooms went. The hall boys, once they were old enough, went. The gardeners went. The gamekeepers, some of them, went. By 1916, the house that had in 1912 employed 40 to 80 indoor servants and a similar body of outdoor staff was running its domestic operation on a skeleton, mostly female, doing the work of twice their number at wages that had not risen to reflect the doubled workload. The hospital was fully staffed with nurses, doctors, orderlies, matrons. The house, beneath and beside the hospital, was staffed by the women who'd not been able to leave. Where the men went, the record follows in fragments. Regimental casualty lists preserve some of them. Village war memorials preserve some. The Highclere estate records preserve some of the names of those who left for service. But the connecting record, The record that would say which of the Highclere footmen of 1913 came back to Hampshire in 1919, and which did not, is not held in one place. The Fifth Earl's own wartime archive, by contrast, is meticulous. It preserves his itinerary, it preserves his travel to Egypt, which continued through the war years when travel was possible. It preserves his correspondence with Carter about the concession and the seasons of digging that were interrupted and resumed. It preserves the days of his weeks in a way that a historian 100 years later can reconstruct, almost hour by hour, where the master of the house was on a given afternoon in a given month in a given year of the war. The servants who fought for the country the master presided over do not have that kind of archive. Their service is scattered, their deaths are recorded where they are recorded in the casualty lists of their regiments, at addresses in London and Kew, in files that require a different set of searches and a different set of catalogues to reach. A researcher can find, in some cases, the names. A researcher can find, in some cases, the dates and the theatres and the causes. But the joining up of these records to the household they had left, the acknowledgement that a particular grave in a particular French cemetery held a young man who had, 3 years earlier, been carrying coal up the back stairs of a house in Hampshire, is work that no one in 1919 was asked to do. The house did not do it. The estate did not do it. The country, taken as a whole, did not do it. The record kept the master's itinerary to the day and forgot which of his footmen came home. This is the moral centre of the story, and it does not have a courtroom. There is no scene of accountability in it. There is no moment at which the disparity is named by anyone in a position to name it. There is a country house that became a hospital and was praised for it, and there is a wing of the same country house whose male staff went to a war of a different order, and there is an archive that recorded one and not the other, and there is a century of subsequent storytelling that has followed the archive. When the story of Highclere in the war is told, and it is told often, and it has been told again in the current era by novelists and screenwriters and television producers, and the current Countess herself, it is the story of the hospital that is told. The story of the footman is the story the archive was not built to hold. And the household, once the hospital closed and the wounded officers went home, and the servants who had done double work at single wages waited to see what would happen next, entered the last stretch of its Edwardian shape without knowing that was what it was doing. The Earl was still travelling. The dig was resuming. Almina was still Countess. The bells still rang in the corridor, though fewer of them, and the corridors themselves were quieter than they had been. The wonderful things were still, in 1919 and in 1920, and in 1921 and through most of 1922, buried beneath the sand of a valley Carter had not yet reached. And then Carter reached them. The date was November the 26th, 1922, and the place was a stone stairway cut into the rock of the Valley of the Kings. And the moment has been reconstructed so many times in so many books and films and museum panels that its details have taken on the polished feel of a legend that always was one. Carter at the sealed door with a candle in his hand, the Earl at his shoulder. The question asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Can you see anything?" And the answer that became the most quoted sentence of 20th century archaeology, "Yes, wonderful things." What the sentence does not tell you is what happened next in Hampshire, because the discovery was not only an event in Egypt, it was, within days, an event on every newspaper front page from London to New York to Sydney. It was the first archaeological find in history to be covered as breaking news, with exclusive contracts and wired photographs and daily bulletins from the Tomb entrance and the Earl of Carnarvon, who had spent 15 years and an inherited Rothschild fortune on a dig that had produced very little, was suddenly one of the most famous men alive. The telegrams poured in. The requests for interviews poured in. The offers for the exclusive rights to the story, eventually settled with the Times of London, poured in. And at Highclere, a house that had spent the war years quieter than it had ever been, the volume of correspondence arriving at the front door, and the volume of visitors arriving at the front door, and the volume of instructions passing through the housekeeper's room began, again, to climb. The staff were not told what any of it meant. This is not a small point. The archive at Highclere preserves, in remarkable detail, the movement of objects from Egypt to Hampshire during the years that followed the discovery. Not the treasures themselves, most of which went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, but the papers and the photographs and the field notes and the personal effects of the Earl, and, in time, the objects from earlier seasons of digging that had been at the house for years, and now, suddenly, meant something they had not meant before. The provenance of these items is recorded. The weight, in some cases, is recorded. The cabinet they went into is recorded. The room the cabinet was in is recorded. What is not recorded is the name of the housemaid who dusted the cabinet. What is not recorded is the name of the footman who carried the crate up the back stairs. What is not recorded is the name of the under-butler, who was told, in a sentence the housekeeper did not think worth writing down, to make sure that particular door stayed locked and that particular key stayed in that particular drawer. The house had by then a rhythm for this. The rhythm was very old. When a valuable thing arrived at Highclere, it was handled by people whose job it was to handle valuable things without leaving a trace of themselves on the handling. A footman lifted a crate the way a footman lifted every crate. A housemaid dusted a cabinet the way a housemaid dusted every cabinet. The value of the object inside the cabinet did not change the wage of the housemaid who dusted it. The fame of the master did not change the hours of the footman who lifted for him. What changed was the pressure, and the pressure changed in a particular way in the winter of 1922 and the spring of 1923, because now the house was famous, and famous houses receive callers, and callers must be received by footmen in clean livery, and callers must be fed by kitchens that do not sleep, and callers must be shown out by butlers who do not yawn, and the correspondence that had climbed at the front door was, at the servants' entrance, being answered in the ordinary way by people whose ordinariness was the entire point. Think, for a moment, about the housemaid at the cabinet. She's perhaps 20. She has been at the house for 4 years, or 6, or 9. She was hired during the war, when the pipeline was thin and the housekeeper was taking whoever could be found, or she was hired after the war, when the country was full of women who had done other work and been sent back to service by the collapse of the industries that had briefly employed them. She knows the room she cleans. She knows the number of pieces on the mantelpiece and the way the light falls through the window in the afternoon, and the particular squeak of the third floorboard from the door. She's been told in the last month that a new cabinet has been placed against the east wall, and that the cabinet is not to be opened, and that the objects on top of the cabinet are to be dusted with a soft cloth, and not with the ordinary cloth, and that the key is with Mr. Streatfield, or with whoever the butler was in that year, and that if there is any question she is to ask the housekeeper, and not to touch anything she is uncertain about. She has done as she was told. She has dusted the top of the cabinet. She does not know what is inside it. She has read, perhaps, in a newspaper the cook shared in the servants' hall, that the master has found a tomb in Egypt and that the king of Egypt is called Tutankhamun, and that the treasures are worth a fortune the newspaper cannot quite bring itself to name. She has not connected the newspaper story to the cabinet. No one has asked her to. Her name is not in the archive. Her name is not in the newspaper. Her name is not in the letters the Earl wrote to Carter that winter, or in the letters Carter wrote back, or in the telegrams from Cairo, or in the wired photographs from the Times. She's present in the house in the way she has always been present in the house. She's the condition under which the house functions. She's not the subject of any sentence written down about the house in that season. There is an irony in this so specific it becomes almost sublime. The Earl of Carnarvon spent the last decade of his life on a project whose entire purpose was to recover the names of the forgotten. That was what Egyptology was, at its most serious. It was the work of taking a wall of hieroglyphs and finding, in the carvings, the name of a scribe who had lived 3,000 years ago, and writing that name down again and giving it back to the record. Carter was very good at this. Carnarvon paid for him to do it. The whole discipline was, in a sense, an act of restitution against oblivion, an insistence that a person who had lived deserved to be remembered by name, even at a distance of 30 centuries, even from beneath a valley of sand. And the same house that funded this restitution ran, in its own basement, on the labour of people whose names were not being written down at all and would not be recovered by any future excavation, because the record was never made in the first place. The wonderful things were coming to light. The people who dusted the shelves they sat on were going into the dark, and then, in the early spring of 1923, the Earl went to Cairo, as he had gone every winter for years, and the mosquito bit him on the cheek, and he cut the bite while shaving, and the cut became infected, and the infection became erysipelas, and the erysipelas became septicemia, and his lungs, which had never been the same since the German Road in 1901, could not carry him through it. He died at the Continental Savoy Hotel on the 5th of April 1923. He was 56. Almina was at his bedside. The world found out within hours. What the world made of it, within days, was the curse. The curse was, in its way, a masterpiece of modern journalism. It required almost nothing to sustain itself. A novelist named Marie Corelli had written, before the death, a letter to a New York newspaper suggesting that anyone who violated a pharaoh's tomb would face consequences. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who by then believed in a great many things, told reporters that malevolent spirits from the tomb might have been involved. The lights in Cairo were said to have flickered at the moment of the Earl's death, which they may well have done, Cairo being a city whose electrical supply in 1923 was not what it later became. The Earl's dog at Highclere was said to have howled and died at the same instant, a story the family did nothing to discourage, and the newspapers repeated for a generation. From these threads, and from the extraordinary hunger of a global readership for a story that could hold the discovery and the death together in a single sentence, the curse was woven, and the curse became the frame through which the whole affair has been remembered since. Below stairs at Highclere, the curse was a story the servants read in the papers. It was not the story they were living. The story they were living was older and duller, and far more dangerous to them personally. The master of the house was dead. The mistress of the house was, by the strict architecture of English aristocratic succession, no longer the mistress of the house. The son, Henry Herbert, was now the 6th Earl of Carnarvon. He had his own household and his own preferences and his own view of which of the servants at Highclere he wished to keep, and which he did not, and there was no mechanism in the law of England in 1923 by which any servant at Highclere could compel him to keep them. There was no severance, there was no pension unless the family chose to grant one. There was no unemployment insurance, for domestic servants had been specifically excluded when the National Insurance Act was passed in 1911, and would remain excluded for a long time yet. There was for every servant in the house the character, and the character was now in the gift of a new master who had not been the one they served, and whose signature on a reference for a housemaid or a footman or an undercook would carry, if it came, no memory of the years those servants had given to his father's household. This is what the servants understood by the word curse, if they used the word at all in the days after April the 5th. Not a pharaoh's revenge. The ordinary architecture of their working lives. The architecture in which a butler who had run the household for 15 years might, in a fortnight, be looking for a place, and the character in his hand might come from a young man who had barely stayed at the house since coming of age, and the young man's judgment of him might turn on nothing more than whether the new earl liked the way his father's butler answered the door. The morning was real, that must be said. The 5th Earl was, by the accounts that survive, an employer with whom the household had a working relationship of considerable duration, and duration in service, in a system that offered no other kind of security, was a form of attachment, and the loss of the person to whom you had been attached for 20 years is a loss even when the terms of the attachment were unequal. The house was hung with black. The blinds were drawn. The servants wore mourning bands, and the mourning was, at the level of the individual, sincere. But it was cross-hatched with a calculation nobody was permitted to speak aloud, which was, what happens to me now? What happens to my sister who works in the kitchen? What happens to my place? What happens to the years I've given? What happens on the day the new earl decides, or the new countess decides, or the new agent decides that fewer footmen are required, or that the housekeeper's manner does not suit them, or that the whole staff will be reviewed and reduced and the corridors will be quieter still? Nobody could ask the question in that form. The question was asked, if it was asked, in the corner of the servants' hall late at night, between two people who trusted each other, and it was answered by whichever of them was more frightened. It did not enter the archive. The archive of the weeks after April the 5th is thick with condolences and telegrams and press notices, and legal correspondence about the estate. It is empty of any note recording what a single servant at Highclere thought about their future in the house in the weeks after their employer died. And then Almina began to pack. She was, by law and by custom, entitled to a great deal. The house on Seymour Place in London was hers. The furniture she had bought was hers. The jewellery she had been given by her father and by her husband was hers. The objects at Highclere, though, were the site of a dispute, because a great house is not, at its core, a collection of movable possessions. It is a collection of specific things arranged in specific rooms in a specific way, and to remove any one thing from any one room is to change the room, and to remove several is to begin to disassemble the house itself. Almina removed several. She removed by contemporary press accounts and the subsequent legal record an extensive quantity of furniture and artwork and objects that she considered hers and that her son considered his, and the dispute between them was carried on in solicitors' letters and, in due course, in the newspapers, which had by then acquired a taste for Carnarvon news that the curse had done nothing to diminish. She also, within 8 months of her husband's death, remarried. Her second husband was Lieutenant Colonel Ian Onslow Dennistoun. The wedding was on the 19th of December 1923. The press treated it as another chapter of the same running serial, and the serial acquired a further instalment 2 years later, when the Dennistouns became parties to a legal proceeding of such peculiar squalor that it dominated the front pages of the summer of 1925 and has been known, in the histories of English scandal, as the Bachelor's Case ever since. The details do not need to be rehearsed here. What matters is that the woman who had been Countess of Carnarvon and the wife of the man who found Tutankhamun's tomb was now, within 2.5 years of his death, the defendant in a suit that was reported in every paper in the country, and that the Carnarvon name, which had been the name of a discovery, was now the name of a scandal, and that this transition was, in the coverage it received, granular. The newspapers followed it with the same precision they had followed the tomb. Every letter read out in court was reprinted, every allegation was itemised, every day of testimony was summarised for readers who could not attend. The record of what the principals said and did and were accused of and denied is preserved in the newspaper archives of London, in a level of detail a historian could spend a career on. The record of what happened to the servants at Highclere during the same period is not preserved at all. There is no list of dismissals, there is no register of severances because there were no severances to register. There is no set of testimonials given by staff about the transition from the 5th Earl's household to the 6th Earl's household. There is no diary that has come to light in which a housemaid describes the day she was told her place was no longer needed. There is no letter, in any collection catalogued anywhere, from a Highclere footman of the 1923 vintage to a Highclere footman of the 1919 vintage, discussing what had become of them both. There may have been such letters. There must statistically have been such letters. They were not kept. The letters that were kept were the ones between the family and the solicitors, and the family and the press and the family and the family. The letters between the servants, if they wrote them, were paper the world did not choose to store. The reckoning did not happen. This is worth naming precisely, because the shape of the story wants a reckoning and does not receive one. There was no inquiry into the welfare of the Highclere staff after the 5th Earl's death. There was no committee formed. There was no journalist who thought the question worth pursuing. There was no member of Parliament who raised it. There was no clergyman who preached on it. There was no reform in the year of the Earl's death or the year after that, in the legal status of the domestic servant in England. The Servants' Characters Act of 1792 was still on the books, still substantially unenforced, and would remain so. The exclusion of domestic servants from national insurance was still in force. The mechanism by which a servant could establish at law a claim on years of past service was still, in every practical sense, non-existent. The person who left Highclere in 1923 or 1924, with a character in their hand from a butler they had known for 20 years was, at law, in precisely the same position as the person who had left Highclere in 1912 or 1902 or 1892 under the same circumstances. Nothing had changed. The war had not changed it. The hospital had not changed it. The discovery had not changed it. The death of the master had not changed it. The country had spent a decade being told that a new world was coming, and in the servants' corridor of one great house, the old world was still the world. Almina took the objects she believed to be hers, and the son sued, and the case was settled, as such cases are, on terms neither party found satisfactory and both parties found bearable. The furniture went in some part to the London house, and later, when the Dennistoun marriage produced its own difficulties, to other destinations that the press followed less closely. The house at Highclere, contracted and quieter, was maintained by the 6th Earl on a scale reduced from his father's. The staff was smaller. The staterooms were less often opened. The house parties were fewer. The old rhythms of the shooting season and the season in town persisted, but at a lower volume and with a smaller company, and the corridors that had once carried 40 or 50 or 60 pairs of feet at 5 in the morning carried now 20 or 30, and then fewer still. What became of the ones who left, in that first winter of the new Earl, is the question the record was not built to answer. Some went to other houses, and the newer houses were themselves contracting, and the situation into which a 50-year-old housekeeper with 20 years at Highclere could hope to be placed was not the situation her equivalent had faced in 1900. Some went to relations and lived in back rooms of the houses of siblings and nieces on terms that were not written down because they were the terms families do not write down. Some went to the workhouse because the workhouse was still there, and the workhouse in the 1920s was where a great many of the old servants of the great houses did in fact end up when the pension was not granted and the relations could not take them in. Some married, at last, having waited so long that the marriage was more a companionship than a household, and lived in cottages on the outskirts of the estate villages, and were seen at church on Sundays, and were buried, when their turn came, in the churchyards of villages whose names appear nowhere in the Highclere archive. Some are simply lost. Their names, if they were ever written in the household books, were not the sort of names anyone thought to preserve, and the books themselves are incomplete, and the researchers who have looked have found what they have found and no more. The house kept the objects. It kept the objects with a care so precise that a century later a curator can tell you the day a particular chair was reupholstered in a particular room. It did not keep the people. It did not need to. The people, in the system as it had been built, were the one part of the arrangement that renewed itself without effort on the house's part from the country outside. When a housemaid left, another housemaid came. When a footman left, another footman came. The names changed and the places did not, and the record was a record of places, and the places were what mattered, and the names were what did not. The wonderful things were in Cairo, and the Earl was in the family vault at Beacon Hill above the estate, and Almina was in London and in the courts, and the son was at the house, and the house was quieter than it had been in the memory of anyone still working in it. The bells still rang, fewer of them, and less often, but they rang. Somewhere in the corridor, a young woman answered a bell at 5 in the morning and climbed a staircase she had climbed 1,000 times, and did the work that had been done in that house every morning for 80 years, and her name was not written down, and the ordinary architecture of her life continued in the shape it had always had, and the century that was going to remake her world had not yet in that corridor, at that hour, arrived. Consider 2 lives that ran parallel through this house and out the other side of it, and consider what each of them was given for the years they spent here. The record does not name them clearly enough to place them in a single room, but the shapes of their lives are shapes the era produced in the thousands, and the shapes are what we have. The first is the one who stayed. Call her the housekeeper, because that is where the woman who stayed usually ended, and she stayed because staying was the only architecture the years had given her. She came to the house as a girl of 15 or 16, from a village whose parish register still holds her baptism and holds nothing else about her, and she began where all such girls began, in the scullery, in the coal, in the black-leaded range and the water-carried up staircases whose tread she came to know by the specific give of each board under a specific weight of pail. She rose in the way the house permitted rising. She became a housemaid, and then head housemaid, and then, after a housekeeper before her retired or died or was let go in one of the quieter economies of a difficult year, she became housekeeper herself, with the keys at her belt and a small sitting room of her own, and the right to be called by her surname preceded by the courtesy Mrs., though she had never married and would not marry, because marriage had not been available to the version of her that could have chosen it, and by the time it was available the version of her that would have chosen it was gone. She served 4 decades in the house, or perhaps a little less, or a little more. The exact figure is not the point, because the figure William Lansley put on his own service was 43 years, and Lansley's book gives us the register in which such a life was described by the person who lived it. Lansley called the great houses homes of comfort, and he meant it. He wasn't being sold to. He was doing the selling in his own memory to himself, because the memory was what he had. She had that too. She had the memory of the corridors at 4 in the afternoon in November, when the light through the high windows above the service stair turned the colour of a weak tea, and the whole basement seemed to hold its breath before the dressing bell. She had the memory of the young footman who came and went, of the shy ones and the vain ones, and the one who could carry 3 plates on his left arm without a tremor, of the one who died at Ypres, and the one who died at Luce, and the one whose name she still, 40 years later, could not read on the war memorial in the village, without stopping for a moment before she walked on. She had the memory of the Countess as a young woman in 1895, all Rothschild money and American vivacity, and the Countess in 1914 turning the staterooms into wards, and the Countess in 1923 packing china into crates while the lawyers argued in London. She had the memory of the old Earl, who had spoken to her twice in 30 years, and had, on the second occasion, remembered her surname, which she had never mentioned to anyone but had privately afterwards understood to be one of the small currencies of her life. She had all of that, and she had, at the end, what the system had built itself to give her. She had a reference letter. The letter was written on the estate's paper and signed by the Countess, or by the agent, or by whichever hand the household had delegated the writing to that season, and the letter said what such letters said, which was that she had been in the service of the family for a long period, and had discharged her duties in a manner that had given satisfaction, and that her character was excellent, and that she was, without qualification, to be recommended. She had a parting gift. The gift was, perhaps, a clock. It was more often a clock than anything else, because a clock was what such houses tended to give, being an object dignified enough to mark the occasion, and inexpensive enough not to embarrass the accounts, and the clock, if it was given, was inscribed on a small brass plate on the back with her name and the dates of her service, and it was the first object she had ever owned that had her name written on it. She had, if she was fortunate, a small sum of money, not a pension in any legal sense but a discretionary gratuity, disbursed once, not renewed, on the understanding that this was the end of the household's obligation and the beginning of whatever came next. What came next was a rented room in the market town nearest to the estate, or the back bedroom of a widowed sister's house, or, if the sister had died and the money had thinned and the clock had been sold, the parish. The parish in the 1920s was where a great many of the women who had run the great households in the 1890s in fact ended up, and the parish did not know what she had been, and would not have cared if it had known, because what she had been was a version of a role that the parish already understood as belonging to a world that was passing. She died, when she died, in a bed that was not her own, in a room whose furniture had been chosen by someone else, and the notice of her death did not appear in any newspaper, and the churchyard in which she was buried was not the churchyard at Highclere, and the house went on without her, and did not know she was gone, because the house had not known she was there in the sense the word knowing usually carries. The house had known that a housekeeper was there. The housekeeper had been her for a while. The housekeeper, when she was gone, was someone else, and then, after that, was no one, because by then the household did not require the office to be filled at the scale it had been filled in her time. Now consider the other. She began where the first began, in the same kind of village and the same kind of scullery, but she left. She left before the war, or she left because of the war, or she left in the strange interval when the war was ending and the country did not yet know what shape it was going to have on the far side. She left because a cousin had written from Woolwich or from Coventry, or from one of the mill towns to say that there was work, and the work was hard and the noise of the work was worse than anything you could imagine. But the money was money you kept, and the hours ended, and the hours that were not the hours of the work were yours. So she went. She wrote a letter to the housekeeper, or she did not write a letter, because writing letters was not what women of her position had been taught to do easily, and she left on a Sunday, and the housekeeper who read the letter, if there was one, or heard of her going if there was not, made a note in the book that the maid had left without notice, and that a character would not be furnished, and that was the end of her in the archive of Highclere. It was not the end of her. She stood for the first weeks in the noise, and the noise was as bad as the cousin had said, and the work was as hard as the cousin had said, and the money was in her hand at the end of the week in a way it had never been in the house, because in the house the money had gone from the agent to the account and had been paid quarterly, with deductions she could not always follow. Now she held it, and she spent some of it on tea in a shop with other women who also held their own money, and who spoke to her without waiting to be spoken to, and she spent some of it on a hat, which was the item women bought first because the hat was the visible token of the change, and she saved some of it because the habit of saving was one of the habits the house had built into her, and the habit was useful now that she had something to save toward. In time she married, and the man she married came from the factory, or from the town near the factory, or from the regiment that had recruited her brothers, and the marriage was not the arrangement the house would have offered her, which was no marriage at all, but a marriage she had chosen from the small field of choices the new world had opened. And she had children, which was the specific thing the house had, in the end, cost the first woman most, and the second woman had them, and they grew up in a small house whose rent she and her husband paid together, and they went to a school, and they read, and one of them, perhaps, in the late 1950s, would tell a grandchild that her mother had been in service at a great house before the war and had left it and had never gone back, and the grandchild would not at the time understand what had been meant by never gone back, and would understand it later. She died in a bed that was her own. The house she died in was not large and was not remarkable, and had her name on the deed or on the rent book, and the notice of her death appeared in a local paper, and the churchyard she was buried in was the churchyard of the parish she had chosen to live in, not the parish she had been born in, and she was buried under the name she'd taken when she married, which was not the name the housekeeper at Highclere would have known her by, so that even if the archive of Highclere had wanted to find her later, it could not have. Two women, then, of the same beginning, and the difference between them was the moment one of them decided that what the house was offering was not, on balance, sufficient, and walked out through the servants' door on a Sunday morning, and the other one, having weighed the same offer, decided that the belonging was worth the terms. Neither was wrong. The one who stayed was given the version of family the house had learned over centuries to counterfeit. The counterfeit was excellent, and it was recognised by those who'd been trained to recognise it, and it satisfied a hunger in her that the alternatives available to her in 1890 or 1895 would not have satisfied. The one who left endured a harder 10 years and arrived, at the end of the 10 years, at a thing the first woman never had, which was a life whose terms she had in some meaningful part set herself. Gordon Grimmett, who worked at Longleat and who wrote about it, said that the landed classes seemed instinctively to know how to treat servants, and what he meant by that, when you read him carefully, was that they knew how to make the servants feel they were being treated well, while treating them precisely as well as the maintenance of the system required, and not 1 degree better. That instinct was the machinery. That instinct was what the first woman had spent 40 years inside of, and what the second woman had spent one Sunday morning walking out of, and the machinery did not, in either case, notice which of them had done what. The machinery required a housekeeper. When the first woman left the office, another woman filled it. The machinery required a hand at the lathe in Coventry. When the second woman arrived at the gate, they gave her a card and a number and put her on the line. The house went on, and the factory went on, and the sentry went on, and the difference between the two women was a difference visible only inside their own lives, at the level of what they held in their hands at the end. Now consider the version of this house that most of the world knows, which is not the house at all, but a program that was filmed inside its rooms and broadcast between 2010 and 2015, and which drew, in its research, on the books written by the present Countess of Carnarvon, including the volume on Almina that lent the program its subtitle in the popular mind. The program is careful in a great many things. It renders the hierarchy accurately. It knows which servant precedes which servant into the hall, and which servant carries which dish, and which servant is permitted to speak in which room. It knows the shape of the baize door and the sound of the bell, and the geography of the below-stairs corridor. It knows the human types the system produced, and it casts them well, and the actors who play them are, at the level of surface, recognisable to anyone who has read the memoirs. The programme shows indignities. The programme shows a scullery maid's hands in the water and a footman standing too long behind a chair, and it does not pretend these things were pleasant, and it does not pretend the wages were adequate, and it does not pretend the character reference system was fair. To that extent it is honest. The dishonesty is at a level below the level of fact. The dishonesty is in what the depiction feels like. The exhaustion in the programme is aestheticised. It is photographed in warm light and scored with strings and framed as the honourable difficulty of honourable work, and the camera lingers on it in a way that invites the viewer to admire the endurance, rather than to be appalled by the necessity. The character reference system in the programme is a plot device, a piece of administrative friction that generates an episode's tension and is resolved within the episode by the intervention of a sympathetic employer. In the archive, it was not a plot device. It was the instrument by which a woman could be made destitute at 48 for having declined a demand she was not, in law or in fact, obliged to meet, and no sympathetic employer intervened because sympathetic employers were, in the surviving records, statistically rare enough that Pamela Cox and other historians of the period have had to note the fondness as the exception rather than the rule. The servants in the programme speak. They speak with the eloquence and self-awareness of people who have had leisure to read and to think about their situations, and the leisure was the one thing the 17-hour day did not leave them. They stand in the servants' hall in the evening and analyse the moral structure of the household, and the analysis is well written, and it is not what the exhausted actual staff were doing at that hour, which was, in the memoirs we have, chiefly falling asleep in chairs. None of that is factual error in the strict sense. The programme is not a documentary. It never claimed to be. The distortion is emotional, and the emotional distortion is the deeper one, because it is the distortion the house itself performed in its own time, and the programme did not so much invent it as inherit it. The programme depicts service as a form of dignity. The record shows dignity as a thing servants manufactured, at cost, against the conditions, from whatever inner materials they had. The conditions themselves supplied no dignity at all, and the pretense that they did was the specific pretense the memoirs, when you read them carefully, are working either to sustain, in the case of Lanceley, or to dismantle, in the case of the women who wrote later and with less to lose. To confuse the two is to accept the counterfeit that Grimmett described. It is to be treated well, in the sense the landed classes meant that phrase, which is why the programme's success is not, on inspection, a departure from the history of the house. It is the continuation of it. The house had, for 200 years before the cameras arrived, been in the business of persuading the people who worked inside it that they were part of something greater than the wages, and the wages were the sole thing that the arrangement in fact provided, and the persuasion had been the labour the house did on top of the labour the servants did, and the persuasion had worked, or had worked well enough for long enough, that the system had lasted until the war made it impossible to sustain. The programme did not misrepresent the house. It performed the function the house had always performed. It made the arrangement look like a family, and it made the servants feel that being inside such an arrangement, even at the bottom of it, was a species of belonging worth the years it cost. This is not a small thing to do. It is the exact thing the house had been doing to actual servants for 2 centuries, and the programme did it to a global audience of viewers who did not have to sleep 4 to a room in the attic to receive it. And the viewers loved it, as the servants had loved it, and for the same reason. The counterfeit is excellent. The counterfeit has always been excellent. It is what the house is for. Ask then, at the end, the question the beginning of this asked: what remains when the romance is removed? Walk down into the basement of Highclere Castle now, in the years since the programme ended, on a day when the house is open to the paying public, and you can see for yourself what remains. The basement is a small museum. It holds an exhibition on the 5th Earl, and on Howard Carter, and on the discovery of the tomb designated KV62, and the exhibition is thoughtful and well lit, and contains artefacts and replicas and photographs, and the field notes of a life's work in the Valley of the Kings, and the visitor moves through it, and reads the panels and comes away with a clear sense of a specific man, and his obsession, and his fortune, and his death. The name Carnarvon is written on the walls of the exhibition many times. The name of the Countess is written there. The name of Carter is written there. The names of the workmen who dug in the Valley of the Kings under Carter's direction are, in the current scholarship, being slowly recovered. Some of them appear now in some accounts, where 30 years ago none of them appeared. The names of the servants who worked in the basement in which the exhibition is now installed are not written on any wall in the basement, or in any other part of the house, or in any archive that has so far been made available to public inspection at the level of the individual life. You walk out of the exhibition, and along a corridor and past a door, and above the door, or in a nearby corridor, in the way these things were installed in the mid-19th century, and left more or less in place as the technology aged, the servant's bell indicator board still hangs. It hangs there now. It is on the tour. Visitors stop in front of it and take photographs of it, because it is one of the recognisable objects, one of the things that was in the programme, and that is really here. The numbers are on it. The little painted panels, or the mechanical flags, or the swinging pendulums by which a bell in a particular room announced itself to the staff in a particular way, are visible and legible and could in principle be made to work, though they are not made to work now because the rooms upstairs are not summoning anyone, and the pools beside the fireplaces are decorative or disconnected or preserved for the tour. Number 9 is on the board. Number 9 has not rung since a morning that is not recorded, in a year that is not recorded, when whoever last used the pull in whichever room number 9 served let it fall for the last time and moved on to something else, and did not know that this had been the last time. The girl who answered number 9 at 5 in the morning in October of 1912 is not named on the board. She's not named on the wall beside the board. She's not named on the panel that explains for the visitors what the board is and how it worked and why it is still here. She's not named anywhere in the house. If she had a headstone, the headstone is in a churchyard we cannot identify. If she had children, the children are in a family whose family memory does not connect the name they carry to the corridor she walked. She's not on the board. The number that summoned her is on the board. The board hangs, and it does not ring. The rooms it served are, at this hour, whichever hour you visit, quiet, and the staircase she climbed is quiet, and the fireplaces she cleaned are cold, and the coal that she carried is not there to be carried, and the water she drew has been running from taps for 100 years. The visitors move on to the next room on the tour. The guide, if there is a guide, says a few sentences about the bell system and moves on with them. The board is left where it is, and the numbers are left where they are. The names are not there, because the names were never there, because the house did not, in the arrangement it had built, require the names to be there for the work to be done. It required the numbers, and the numbers are what it kept, and the numbers are what is on the wall. Outside, above the estate, on Beacon Hill, the 5th Earl is in the family vault where he was placed in the spring of 1923. In Cairo, the things that were found in the tomb are in the museum in which they have, after long negotiation, been settled. In London, the newspapers that reported the discovery and the death and the remarriage and the lawsuits are on the shelves of the archives that keep such things. In the basement, the board hangs. No one is coming to answer it. No one in the corridor where it hangs is listening for it. The girl who once did is not there, and was never, in the sense the house understood the word, there, and is not now, anywhere the house has thought to record. The board hangs and it is silent, and the silence is the answer.